All right, welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going to try to make sense of this whole Zelensky White House visit. I mean, this was supposed to be, a show of solidarity, right, with war still raging and all.
Right.
And maybe even iron out that mineral deal we've been hearing about.
Yeah, you'd think so, right? With all that was at stake, instead it kind of blew up in everyone's faces. Not exactly a diplomatic success story.
Definitely not the photo op anyone was expecting.
Yeah.
So to understand how it went so sideways, let's go back to the beginning. We both went through all the reports, the analyses, even some social media reactions.
Oh yeah, social media was buzzing, let me tell you. A lot of opinions flying around out there.
A lot to unpack, for sure. So going into this visit, Zelensky's main goal, at least from what I gathered, was to secure these security guarantees from the U.S. Essentially a promise that they've got his back if Russia, tries anything funny after a ceasefire.
Yeah, he was very insistent on that point. And, when you look back, it makes sense, right? Zelensky kept bringing up all those times Russia went back on its word, signed agreements, promised peace, then boom, back to square one.
So he sees these guarantees as like the only way to actually trust any deal with Putin?
Exactly. For him, it's not just about words on paper. It's about having a real deterrent, knowing that someone's got your back if things go south.
But isn't that what NATO membership is supposed to provide? Why not just, fast track Ukraine into NATO and call it a day?
Well, it's not that simple. Bringing Ukraine into NATO, especially with the war still going on, is a very sensitive topic, to say the least. Some NATO members worry it would escalate the conflict even further.
Right, like poking the bear, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. And you've also got countries like Germany and France who are, shall we say, a little hesitant to provoke Russia any more than they already have.
So Zelensky stuck between a rock and a hard place, needing more than just words from the U.S., but not being able to get that full NATO membership just yet.
Yep, that's the dilemma. And that's why these security guarantees were so important for him. He needed something concrete, something he could show his people, like a real commitment from the U.S.
Okay, so that's Zelensky's side of things.
Yeah.
But then you've got Trump, who, seemed to have a very different idea of how this meeting should go.
He did. And to understand his perspective, you have to remember his whole America First approach to foreign policy. He's not really a fan of these long-term commitments overseas, He wants to see results, a ceasefire, without getting bogged down in what he sees as endless promises.
And these security guarantees for Ukraine would definitely fall under endless promises.
Oh, for sure. And there's also the mineral deal to consider. The U.S. has had its eye on those Ukrainian mineral reserves for a while now. Lithium, cobalt, titanium, all of that good stuff that's vital for high-tech industries.
Yeah, I was reading about that. On the surface, it seems like a pretty sweet deal for both sides. U.S. invests in Ukraine's mining sector, gets access to these valuable resources, and Ukraine gets much-needed funds, maybe even becomes less reliant on direct military aid, right?
Yeah, that was the idea, at least initially. But when you look closer at the reports, it seems like they were getting stuck on the details, how much the U.S. would invest, who would have control over the mining operations, that kind of thing.
Ah, so the devil's in the details, as they say. And I'm guessing those disagreements were tied to the whole security guarantees issue. Zelensky probably saw the mineral deal as leverage, a way to get the U.S. more firmly on his side.
It does seem that way, yeah. Almost like he was saying, you want our resources, then give us the security guarantees we need. Kind of a bargaining chip.
A bargaining chip that didn't work, clearly. Instead of striking a deal, the whole thing just imploded. And I mean, that Oval Office shouting match.
Yeah. Yeah, that was something else. And the fact that it was all caught on camera for the whole world to see. I mean, you read that transcript and you can practically feel the tension in that room.
It's intense. Trump accusing Zelensky of disrespecting the U.S., not being grateful enough for all the aid they've already given. Vance chimes in, questioning Zelensky's military strategy, even implying he should be thanking Trump for trying to end the war.
And Zelensky, to his credit, didn't just sit there and take it. He pushes back, even invites Vance to come visit Ukraine himself, see the reality of the situation firsthand.
So it goes from a tense negotiation to a full-blown diplomatic meltdown, all with the cameras rolling, accusations flying, and then Zelensky basically gets kicked out of the White House.
Yeah, not exactly the outcome anyone was hoping for. So the question is, what happens next? How does the rest of the world react to this spectacle, and what does it all mean for the war in Ukraine?
So the whole world just watched this this total train wreck in the Oval Office. I can't even imagine how other countries reacted to this.
Yeah, it definitely put everyone in a tough spot because this wasn't just, a U.S. Ukraine thing anymore. It really brought to light all those cracks that were already there in terms of how different countries view the conflict.
Right, like some were probably all for Zelensky, calling out Trump's behavior, while others might have been more like, hey, Trump's right, just end the fighting already.
Exactly. It almost felt like everyone had to pick a side, and, some were pretty vocal about it, like Macron, for instance. He put out a statement right away. Full-on support for Zelensky, really strong condemnation of Russia.
Mincing words there.
Not at all. And he also stressed this idea of transatlantic unity, how important it is to present a united front in supporting Ukraine.
I bet he saw this whole incident as, trying to undermine that unity, maybe even embolden Putin a little.
Yeah, it definitely fits with his whole push for a more independent European defense posture, hey, Europe can't always rely on the U.S., and this whole thing probably just reinforced that view.
Didn't Trudeau also come out pretty strongly in support of Zelensky?
He did, and he actually went a step further, announced they were upping their military aid to Ukraine, specifically anti-tank weapons and training, really putting their money where their mouth is.
So you got France, Canada. I'm guessing the UK was on the same page?
Oh, absolutely. Starmer was very clear about the UK's commitment to Ukraine, their sovereignty, all of that. He did call for a de-escalation, a return to dialogue, but made it very clear they were standing with Ukraine.
Okay, so a pretty united front from those major NATO players.
Yeah.
But you mentioned before, not everyone was exactly in Zelensky's corner. Something about Hungary.
Yeah, Orban has been, a little out of step with the rest of the EU on this. He's not a fan of the sanctions against Russia, and he's actually kept a pretty decent relationship with Putin.
So not surprising that he was more in line with Trump's, let's just get a ceasefire approach.
Right, this is the pragmatic way to stop the fighting, put an end to the bloodshed. That was his whole take.
So even within the EU, you've got these cracks, these different ideas about how to handle Russia in this whole war.
Exactly. And then, of course, you've got Russia itself. Medvedev, the former president, he was pretty much loving this whole thing, praising Trump's tough stance towards Zelensky. Even called him a puppet of the West.
Makes you wonder if Putin was watching this all unfold with a smile on his face. A rift between the U.S. and Ukraine, that's going to be music to his ears.
Yeah, plays right into his whole strategy, right? Divide and conquer. A weakened NATO, the West all fractured, and Ukraine on its own. That's the dream scenario for him.
Not a very comforting thought. But okay, so we've got all this international drama, this back and forth, this picking sides, but what about the people actually in Ukraine? What about the fighting, the real life impact of all of this?
That's where that analysis from James Waterhouse comes in. Remember him, the correspondent we talked about?
Yeah, the guy who's been reporting from Kyiv this whole time.
Right, he's got a pretty good feel for what's going on there on the ground.
So what's his take? What are people in Ukraine saying about this whole blow up with the U.S.?
Well, one thing he points out is that even with all this, diplomatic chaos, these public disagreements, there's this, a sense of unity within Ukraine itself. People are putting aside their differences, coming together because of this existential threat.
It's interesting. Usually you hear about how wars, they tear people apart, make those internal divisions even worse. But it sounds like it's having the opposite effect in Ukraine.
That's the resilience he keeps talking about, this feeling that they're fighting for their survival, for who they are as a nation.
It must be hard, though, to maintain that unity when you're also dealing with, the constant threat of bombs and attacks.
Oh, for sure. Waterhouse doesn't sugarcoat it. He talks about the shelling, the displacement, the constant fighting, the reality of war, even with all the diplomatic stuff going on.
So it's like these two parallel worlds, almost the high-level diplomacy and then just the everyday struggle to survive.
Yeah, good way to put it. And Waterhouse is very clear. He says, no matter what happens with the U.S., that need for support, military aid, humanitarian help, all of it, it's more vital than ever. He basically argues that the U.S. has a moral obligation to stand with Ukraine, help them defend themselves.
Can't really argue with that, especially with everything that's happening there.
He also says something else, something kind of interesting. He thinks that even with all this public arguing, there's still room for, collaboration between the U.S. and Ukraine down the line.
Like maybe this was just a temporary setback, a bump in the road.
That's one way to look at it. But
Yeah.
he also brings up this question, what if this whole thing actually pushes Ukraine closer to Europe? Like they start looking for stronger partnerships there to make up for a potentially less reliable U.S.
So instead of moving away from Russia towards the U.S., they end up moving away from the U.S. towards Europe.
It's definitely a possibility. I mean, we already saw those strong statements from European leaders, right? Maybe this just speeds things up. More military cooperation, closer economic ties, maybe even a faster track to EU membership. Who knows?
That would be a huge shift geopolitically. They've been walking this tightrope for years, trying to balance between Russia and the West. But this could, really tip the scales towards Europe.
And that's where it gets interesting. Imagine Ukraine more aligned with the EU, militarily and economically, less reliant on the US. That changes the whole game in Eastern Europe.
Putin wouldn't be happy about that, that's for sure. He's been trying to pull them back into Russia's orbit, but this could end up pushing them even further away.
Talk about unintended consequences, right? He thought he could, exploit the divisions in the West, weaken NATO, isolate Ukraine, but he might have just achieved the opposite.
But let's not forget there's still a war happening, right? All this, geopolitical maneuvering, all these potential shifts, it's happening against the backdrop of a conflict that's killing people every single day.
Yeah, good point. And it brings us back to what Waterhouse was saying. No matter what happens diplomatically, the U.S. can't turn its back on the Ukrainian people. They're fighting for their lives.
And he made a pretty strong case for why the U.S. needs to stay involved, even if things are, a little messy with Zelensky right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's right. It's a complicated situation. No easy answers.
That's why I think this deep dive has been so helpful. We haven't just talked about what happened. We've really explored the different angles, what it might lead to, all the possibilities. And now it's really up to our listeners, right, to take all this in and draw their own conclusions.
So we've really gotten into the weeds on this one, right? I mean, the motivations, the fallout, what everyone's saying around the world. This feels different, bigger than just a diplomatic misstep. Where do we even go from here? What does this mean for, everything?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to be honest, it's tough to say for sure how this is all going to shake out. You've got the war itself, which is, its own wild card. Then you've got internal politics in both the U.S. and Ukraine. And the whole international scene, which is, always shifting.
Okay, no crystal ball predictions. I get it. But can we at least, brainstorm a little? What are some possible paths forward? What are the most likely scenarios we could be looking at?
Sure, let's start with the most obvious one, the U.S.-Ukraine relationship. I mean, one possibility is that this whole thing just makes things worse, More mistrust, harder to work together.
Which would be a nightmare for Zelensky, right? I mean,
Yeah.
He's been counting on the U.S. big time for military aid, financial support, the whole 9 yards. If that dries up, it puts him in a really tough spot.
Exactly. And it makes Ukraine, more vulnerable to pressure from Russia. Imagine if the U.S. backs off, Europe can't or won't fill the gap. Zelensky might have to give Putin something just to keep the country afloat.
Not a great picture.
Yeah.
But you mentioned before that this could also, push Ukraine closer to its European neighbors. Couldn't that, balance things out a bit? If they lose support from the U.S., maybe they gain more from Europe.
That's the more optimistic take. We've already got Macron, Trudeau. They're pretty vocal in their support. Maybe this whole thing actually pushes Ukraine and the EU closer. More military help, closer economic ties. Heck, maybe even a faster track to EU membership. Who knows?
That would be a huge change, right? Geopolitically, it's massive. For years, they've been trying to walk this line between Russia and the West. And this could be the thing that tips them, firmly towards Europe.
And that's where things get really interesting. Ukraine more aligned with the EU, militarily and economically, less reliant on the US. That changes the whole power dynamic in Eastern Europe.
Putin would not be a happy camper.
Yeah.
He wants Ukraine back in Russia's sphere.
All right.
But this could end up doing the exact opposite.
Unintended consequences, right. He thought he could, stir the pot in the West, weaken NATO, leave Ukraine out in the cold. But he might have just achieved the opposite.
We keep saying that, right?
Yeah.
But there's still a war going on. All this geopolitical stuff, these what-ifs about alliances, it's happening while people are dying. Every day.
Absolutely. Can't forget that. And that's why I think what Waterhouse said is so important, Whatever happens with the diplomacy, the U.S. can't just walk away. The Ukrainian people need help. They're fighting for their lives.
He was pretty clear about that, yeah.
Yeah.
Even if things are, a little rocky with Zelensky right now, the U.S. needs to stay involved.
Yeah.
But it's messy, right? No easy solutions.
Nope, no easy answers here. And that's why I think this deep dive has been so, I don't know, so eye-opening. We didn't just rehash the events, we dug into the different sides, the what-ifs, the possible outcomes. Now it's up to our listeners to, take all this in and make their own judgments.
We've given them the info, the analysis, the context. Now it's their turn, right?
Okay.
Connect the dots. Think about what this means for Ukraine, for Europe, for the U.S.'s role in all of this.
We said at the start this was a pivotal moment, and I think the more we've unpacked it, the more that's become clear. This whole thing could change alliances, affect the war, even redefine what the relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine looks like going forward.
So as you keep following the story, remember what we talked about today. Watch for the signals, the changes in how people are talking about it, what the key players are actually doing. Because the future of this conflict, maybe even the future of Europe.
And remember, there's always more than one way to see things. Don't just take one source, one story at face value.